The road stretched endlessly into darkness, swallowed by the night. My car sat lifeless under a flickering streetlight, its hood still warm from the drive. Mist coiled around my feet like grasping hands, the cold air biting at my skin. I cursed under my breath, kicking the tire in frustration. No signal, no signs of life. Just silence. Too much silence. The trees lining the road stood still, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. Then, in the distance, headlights. A slow-moving vehicle, its beams cutting through the mist. Relief flooded me, but only for a moment. The headlights grew closer, their beams stretching unnaturally far down the road. The engine rumbled, a low, guttural sound, uneven and sickly. When the truck finally stopped, I saw it was ancient, its blue paint chipped and rusted, its body groaning as it settled. Smoke seeped lazily from under the hood. The driver leaned out, his face half hidden in shadows. A scraggly gray beard framed his hollow cheeks, his eyes dark and unreadable. He grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Howdy, son. Need a ride?" His voice was deep, gravelly, like metal scraping against metal. Something inside me whispered, "Run." Inside the truck, the air felt heavy, suffocating. The dim dashboard lights flickered, casting sickly green shadows over the cracked leather seats. The driver's hands, thick and gnarled like tree roots, gripped the wheel too tightly. His knuckles were bone white. The road outside twisted endlessly into darkness, no signs of civilization, just a black void stretching ahead. The radio crackled, spewing bursts of static, then whispers. Faint, distorted voices slithered through the speakers before cutting out. The driver broke the silence. "Where you headed?" His voice was calm, too calm. My stomach twisted. Something about this ride felt wrong. The ride stretched on in uneasy silence. The road outside seemed endless, swallowed by the black void beyond the headlights. The air inside the truck was thick, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. I could hear the driver breathing, slow, steady, deliberate. Then, without looking away from the road, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, dark and square. "Have some gum," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated. The object in his palm was unlike any gum I had ever seen. It was black, dense, almost waxy looking. Something about it seemed off. My throat tightened. He wasn't chewing any himself. I forced a nervous chuckle. "Not a fan of gum," I lied. His grip on the wheel tightened, his fingers twitching slightly. "Go on," he insisted, his voice now eerily firm. I didn't want to offend him. Slowly, I took the small black square and placed it in my mouth. The taste hit instantly, bitter, chemical, unnatural. My stomach churned. The truck around me seemed to shift, the dashboard lights warping and twisting. My vision blurred, my limbs went numb. Then, the world collapsed into darkness. A sharp metallic banging echoed through the darkness, distant, hollow, like something heavy being dragged. My head throbbed, my mouth tasted like rust and chemicals. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the dim, flickering light. The smell hit me first, burned paper, oil, and something sickly sweet like rotting metal. I wasn't in the truck anymore, I was lying in the back seat, my body twisted awkwardly. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as a faint breeze pushed against it. The driver was gone. Outside, endless mountains of scrap metal towered in the shadows, their jagged edges catching the weak glow of a far-off street lamp. Old, burned-out cars sat in silent decay, their hollow frames watching like empty eyes. Pain flared through my face. My hand shot up instinctively, fingers grazing a deep, wet gash on my cheek. My wrist burned, a different kind of pain. I looked down, a mark branded into my skin, still raw and searing. A circle with a cross through it, its bottom line stretching down my arm to my elbow. My breathing hitched. My chest tightened. I wasn't just left here. I was marked. My wrist throbbed, the burned symbol pulsing like it was alive. I stumbled out of the truck, my legs weak, the world tilting around me. The junkyard stretched in all directions, twisted metal, rusted car frames, mountains of forgotten debris. But something felt off. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching a metallic creak echoed from somewhere deep in the wreckage. Then another. Slow, purposeful. Footsteps, I held my breath. Shadows shifted between the stacks of scrap, something moving just out of sight. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wasn't alone, and whatever was here knew I was awake. I ran. My body ached, my head swam, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The junkyard seemed endless, a maze of rusted wreckage and forgotten things. Every twisted piece of metal looked like something reaching for me. Behind me, something moved. Slow, deliberate. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like hours, I burst onto the road. My house was close, just a mile. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, my breath ragged. The mark on my wrist burned like fire, but I didn't stop. The porch light flickered as I stumbled toward the front door, my hands shaking. It creaked open before I could knock. My mother stood there, her face twisted in shock. "Oh my God, your face." What happened? I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "Cut myself fixing the car." She wasn't convinced. Her eyes drifted downward, widening in horror. "What is that?" On your arm, I hesitated. My sleeve had slipped, revealing the brand, the deep blackened scar. She reached for it, but I pulled away. I could lie about my face, but the mark told a different story. One I wasn't ready to understand. There are some moments in life that burn themselves into your memory. Moments so bizarre and unexplainable that they leave you questioning reality. This is one of those moments. Then she saw him. A lone figure standing at the edge of the woods, motionless. At first he was just a shape, barely visible against the darkness of the trees. But something about him pulled her in. An unnatural stillness. A presence that demanded attention. He wasn't moving, yet his piercing gaze cut through the distance, locked onto her. The traffic crawled forward, but he remained frozen, unblinking. A cold dread crept into her chest. There were dozens of cars, hundreds of people, yet somehow she knew. He wasn't watching the road, he was watching her, and he wasn't looking away. As the car inched closer, the details sharpened. He was thin, almost sickly, his skin pale to the point of translucence. Scruffy white hair framed a gaunt face, his beard patchy and unkempt. But it was his eyes that sent a chill through her. Ice blue, nearly white, void of warmth or humanity. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. His focus never wavered. It was as if she was the only thing in existence. The closer they got, the heavier the air became, thick with something unseen. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. It felt like he wouldn't let her. Then he smiled. A slow, unnatural stretch of his lips, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. It was too wide, too deliberate, as if he were forcing his face into something resembling human expression. His pale eyes remained locked on hers, unblinking, unshaken. As the car pulled beside him, his head turned in perfect sync, following their movement with an eerie precision. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't coincidence. It was intentional. A chill crawled down her spine. His grin deepened, as if he knew the fear twisting in her gut. The car rolled past, but the weight of his stare never lifted. As they passed, she twisted in her seat, unable to break free from his stare. His head moved unnaturally, turning to follow, his grin never fading. The motion was smooth, too smooth, as if his neck weren't bound by the limits of bone and muscle. Her breath hitched. The distance grew, yet his eyes never wavered. Even as the taillights of the car stretched the shadows between them, he remained locked onto her, unblinking, unmoving. The traffic crawled forward, yet time felt distorted, stretched thin like a fraying thread. She clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. A cold sweat clung to her skin. She wanted to look away, to shake this presence from her mind. But she couldn't. The world around her felt muted, unreal, as though he had momentarily stepped outside of reality, dragging her with him. Then, just as he was about to fade into the darkness, his expression shifted. The grin, impossibly wide, seemed to twitch, almost like approval. And then finally, He disappeared into the distance. The spell broke. The world snapped back into motion. She gasped, lungs burning, turning to her mother. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Inside the car, silence stretched thick and heavy. The hum of the engine, the faint chatter of a distant radio station, none of it felt real. The girl sat rigid in her seat, her heart beat a deafening thrum in her ears. She turned slowly to her mother, who gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "You saw him, didn't you?" the girl finally whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Her mother nodded, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "He was you staring at us," she murmured. "At you." The girl swallowed hard. The feeling still clung to her skin, like icy fingers trailing down her spine. "Mom, his eyes. They weren't normal." Her mother exhaled shakily, gripping the wheel tighter. "His skin. I've never seen anyone that pale." A pause. Then, almost to herself, she muttered, "Like a ghost." The words hung in the air, suffocating, undeniable. The girl shuddered. Something had been wrong with that man, something beyond reason, beyond logic. Outside, the night deepened. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty. But no matter how far they drove, one thought clawed at the back of her mind. Was he still watching? Days later, she searched for answers. What she found sent a chill through her bones. The highway was haunted. Newspaper clippings, online forums, whispered stories. People spoke of figures appearing on the roadside, locking eyes with drivers, only to vanish into thin air. Some swerved to avoid something that wasn't there. Others claimed to see a man, pale, grinning, always watching. The deeper she looked, the worse it got. Accidents, unexplained disappearances, a pattern stretching back decades. She sat back, heart pounding. That night, she dreamed of the man's face smiling, waiting. And when she woke, she swore. She felt him nearby. It was 2 a.m. The streets were empty, lifeless, except for the flickering streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. A 15-year-old boy walked alone, his hoodie pulled tight against the cold. Every distant sound, a car door slamming, a bottle rolling on the pavement, made his heart race. He regretted everything, the party, the lies, the missed bus. Now he was stranded in a part of town where danger lurked behind every corner. Dark figures moved in the distance, watching, waiting. He quickened his pace, every instinct screaming, "You shouldn't be here." But the night was far from over. The horror had just begun. The boy stood at the curb, hesitating. The silence of the night pressed down on him, broken only by the distant hum of a passing car. He raised his thumb, desperation overriding caution. One car passed, then another, 5 in total, each disappearing into the darkness. Then headlights flickered ahead. A rusted red Honda Civic slowed to a stop. The window rolled down just enough to reveal a shadowed face. "Need a ride?" The voice was calm, too calm. The boy swallowed hard. Every instinct told him to run. Instead, he nodded and stepped inside. The door shut with a hollow finality. Inside the car, the air was thick, stale, heavy, suffocating. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, casting a sickly green hue over cracked leather seats. A beaded rosary swayed from the mirror, clicking softly with each bump in the road. The driver gripped the wheel too tightly, his knuckles white. His eyes flicked toward the boy, studying him. "What school do you go to?" His voice was casual, but something felt wrong. "Where do you live?" Each question felt like a trap. The boy shifted uncomfortably, his pulse quickening. Outside, the streets blurred into darkness. Inside, the real danger was sitting beside him. The boy's hands clenched into fists. The questions kept coming, each one more invasive than the last. His breath was shallow, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Then ahead, a red light. His chance. He forced himself to stay calm, eyes locked on the door handle. The car slowed to a stop. Silence. He could feel the driver watching him. 1 second, 2, then he moved. Yanking the handle, he shoved the door open and bolted. A furious shout erupted behind him. Tires screeched. Footsteps pounded the pavement. He didn't look back, he just ran. The forest loomed ahead, dark and waiting. The boy sprinted into the forest, branches whipping against his skin. The air was thick, damp, filled with the scent of decaying leaves. Behind him, footsteps, heavy, fast, too close. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't dare stop. Then, silence. He pressed against a massive tree, forcing himself to breathe quietly. A voice shattered the stillness. "Where are you?" It wasn't just angry. It was hungry. The footsteps returned, slower this time, circling. Searching. The boy's hands trembled as he covered his mouth. Then, sirens in the distance. Hope. The footsteps stopped. And just like that, the faceless man disappeared. Red and blue lights pulsed against the trees, turning the dark forest into a shifting nightmare of shadows. The boy stood frozen, his chest heaving, his ears ringing with the distant wail of sirens. Then, a voice. Deep, steady, cutting through the night like a lifeline. "It's the police." For a moment he hesitated. His mind screamed that it could be a trick, another trap. But then, through the tangled branches, he saw them. Uniforms, flashlights cutting through the fog. Real. Safe. His legs nearly gave out as he stumbled forward, emerging from the trees like a ghost. A tall officer met him halfway, his face shifting from alert to concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning the boy's pale, terrified face. I don't know," the boy muttered, still breathless, still shaking. He turned back toward the forest. It was quiet now, too quiet. The man was gone, vanished as if he had never been there at all, but the boy knew better. He could feel it. The night wasn't empty. Something was still there, hidden in the trees, watching, waiting even in the presence of safety. He wasn't sure he'd ever feel safe again. The police car pulled up in front of his house, the red and blue lights reflecting off the windows. The boy sat in the back seat, staring blankly ahead, his hands still trembling. He was safe now, wasn't he? The officer turned to him, his voice calm. "You're home, kid." The front door swung open before he could move. His mother stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with worry. The second she saw him, relief washed over her, and she pulled him into a tight embrace. He could feel her heart pounding. He expected anger, yelling, punishment, but all she did was hold him. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. The boy clutched her tighter, but his eyes drifted past her back toward the street. It was quiet now, normal, but the darkness beyond the streetlights felt different, heavier. Somewhere out there, the faceless man had disappeared into the night, vanishing like smoke. But he wasn't gone, as his mother guided him inside. The boy hesitated at the doorway, taking one last look at the shadows beyond the curb. For a moment he swore he saw movement. Then the door closed, and the night swallowed the street whole.